Good evening. I'm Paul Farber. I'm director of Monument Lab, and I am thrilled to welcome all of you to this first edition of our public workshop series, which is curated by our senior curator, Yolanda Wisher, who you'll hear from in just a few moments. Just to give some context, we are Monument Lab. We are a nonprofit public art, history, and design studio. We're based in Philadelphia, and we work to unearth the next generation of monuments. This public workshop series is a resource for artists, for storytellers, educators, municipal workers, and monument changemakers. We will be offering approximately every quarter virtual and in-person opportunities for exploration and exchange around various practices of commemoration. And this workshop series will focus on different topics throughout the year. Because we are now in National Poetry Month, we thought it was fitting to start with poetry as our way into the field of commemoration. Our public workshop series is presented with major support from the Mellon Foundation. We are grateful to the Mellon Foundation and the Monuments Project for their support. As we have many friends, old and hopefully new, here with us tonight, before I pass it over to my colleague Yolanda Wisher, I do want to kind of shout out 2 opportunities to engage with us in the coming months. We are hosting our Promument. It's our annual celebratory event on May 23rd in Philadelphia at the Liberty View Room at the Independence Visitor Center right off of Independence Mall. And we'll be sharing a link in the chat. And currently we're in early bird phase, and there's heavy discounts for those who are interested, and always a student and educators rate. We also will be holding a summit, Monument Lab Changemaker Summit, this summer, also in Philadelphia. So please join us July 18th and 19th. You can register for keynotes, workshops, field trips, and people coming from near and far to join with us. Those are our ways to keep engaging with us. You can also follow us on social media, join our mailing list. And I want to just use that as a moment to welcome you all here as we kick off this new series. We did think it was fitting, in large part, to start with poetry. If you think about inaugural events, whether they are for electoral politics or for school years, or even just those moments where we need guidance and balance, poetry leads us in the right direction. I'm grateful because in my family, I have a poet who has emerged over the year. My father, Barry, is the constant poet in my life. I think he's here tonight, so I want to shout him out. And of course, my mom, who is also a muse there as well. Another poet in my life who's near and dear is Monument Lab senior curator Yolanda Wisher. Known Yolanda for a long time, Yolanda was actually one of the first people to speak at a Monument Lab event almost a decade ago in Philadelphia City Hall. It was election day, and we wanted to hear from the poets. Yolanda Wisher and Tom Devaney shared their visions for monuments in the city of Philadelphia, utilizing the power of poetry in public space. Yolanda also was a participant in 2017 in our Monument to the Philly Poet event on the Parkway, and along with Trapita Mason, was a leader in the first iteration of Regeneration for their Consensus project based here in Philadelphia, honoring the legacy of Black women and femme poets in the city. Yolanda joined our staff. We're thrilled to have her as a senior curator at Monument Lab. She's envisioned this series, and without further ado, please join me wherever you are in sending that energy out and welcoming Yolanda Wisher.
Thanks, Paul. Hey, everybody. It's so good to be here. Thank you for so many of those beautiful words. And shout out to your dad, the poet, and all the poets in the house, and all the parents who love them. We're here to kick off National Poetry Month, probably one of my favorite months of the year, with a set of presentations and conversations exploring the future of poetry in public spaces. I'm joined tonight by three guests, Ryan Mather, Sasha Stiles, and Carolyn, Zhang, who you'll meet shortly. The goals of this series, as I see it for this event tonight, is to explore the ways that poets are, can be, and can see themselves as monument change makers. Defining the field of poets doing the work that intersects with the work of Monument Lab and its community is part of the goal of tonight's event too. And I hope that this series will center artists, storytellers, educators, and grassroots organizers. I hope all of y'all are out there listening as drivers of change in public spaces and give you more tools and ideas to do that work. So there are so many amazing, innovative initiatives around poetry happening today that I wanted to explore through this event. And these are you're going to hear just a couple of them tonight, and hopefully they'll spark you to go and research more. And I think that there's some really interesting, exciting things happening in poetry that haven't happened before, that are the result of just our search for a greater sense of belonging, a way to mark the presence in the past and future in our public and memoryscapes. And I think poetry has a great potential that people are realizing and using and thinking about in the realm of public art as a way to shape our understanding of identity and culture, to disrupt power dynamics, and to reimagine historical narratives. So I've got three exciting guests for you to meet. They're going to talk about their work. We're going to have a conversation, and then you're going to be able to ask your own questions. There might even be some playful ways to interact with our guests today. So my first guest is Sasha Stiles. Sasha Stiles is a first-generation Kalmyk-American poet, artist, and AI researcher, widely recognized as a pioneer of generative literature and language art. Her award-winning work fuses text and technology to probe what it means to be human in an increasingly post-human era. Stiles is author of the instant techno-classic poetry collection, Technology, and has been named, quote, perhaps the leading blockchain poet by Right Click Save, as well as one of the top 10 NFT artists to watch in 2023. In 2022, she became the first writer to publish AI-powered literature via a major auction house. A sought-after thought leader in artificial intelligence, natural language processing, blockchain poetics, and publishing innovation, Stiles has been invited to speak at events and institutions, and her work has been exhibited around the world, including on the billboards of Tokyo and New York City. Stiles is engaged as a poetry mentor to one of the world's most advanced humanoid AI robots. She is also co-founder of the Verse, an acclaimed crypto literary collective where poetry is code, poems are art, and language is limitless. A graduate of Harvard and Oxford, Stiles lives just outside of New York City. Sasha is taking poetry to some intriguing and oracular places. I'm delighted that she can join us the day before the release of her first edition of a handmade book series, 4 core texts, Humanifesto and Other Poems, which evokes T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets, which was definitely part of my reading in grad school. Just today, she released the sneak preview of Humanifesto, an 11-minute epic poem about what it means to be human, written by her AI alter ego. Sasha is a poet new to me. I'm so excited about her work. It makes me so curious and makes me feel like I'm just beginning to learn about poetry again. And she feels like an OG in the making. Please welcome Sasha Stiles.
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you so much, Yolanda, for the warm introduction. Thank you, Paul, and thanks everyone for having me here. I am saying hi to everyone from New York City, where I am stationed for the next few days in my hotel, actually preparing for a few events related to the release of the new book that Yolanda just mentioned. So hi to everyone from rainy New York City. I want to share some slides as I go through just to kind of illustrate areas of my practice and to share some examples. So I think I'll start by getting that set up, and then we'll dive right in. And I'm really excited to get to have this opportunity to be here with you all. So sharing my screen. Okay. And we should be in business. Someone please give me a shout if there's any issues, but you should be seeing a mishmash of print literary journals on your screen right now. This is where I want to start. I want to start by giving you a little bit of backstory. I just want to explain a bit about my practice and kind of how I came to be where I am, which is at this very interesting, exhilarating intersection of text and technology. But, you know, I'm really a lifelong poet. National Poetry Month is also very important to me. I've been celebrating it for a long time. I've been writing since I was a kid, and I studied language and literature when I was in school. You know, a little bit more traditional than I think, you know, the poetry that I'm writing now suggests, but really it's been a lifelong love of words that kind of underpins everything that I'm doing at the moment. And what you see on screen is just sort of a smattering of the print poems that I've published over the years. A lot of these poems, you know, as you can see, they're printed on paper. They're somewhat conventional in that sense, but a lot of them are about technology. Some of them are about speculative technologies. Some of them are about the future. They're about things like writing with artificial intelligence and the development of artificial wombs and the quest for digital immortality. And I've always been really interested in using poetry as a way to grapple with some of these ideas, these concepts that equally sort of, you know, fascinate me and frighten me, as I think they probably do for so many of us. I think we're living through a moment of just astonishing, seismic technological transformation. And poetry, at least for me, is a way to sort of come to terms with a lot of what we're experiencing. It's sort of a touchstone. It's something that we've had, you know, at our fingertips for almost as long as we've been human. And so I keep coming back to it as a really important way to kind of ground myself in the midst of all this unprecedented change. I'm often asked why, as a poet, I'm interested in this future-facing stuff, the things I just mentioned. And my answer is often that I really regard poetry as technology. I see them as sort of being one and the same in some very fundamental ways. Some of my favorite poets, like William Carlos Williams and Paul Valéry, for example, have described poems as machines for making meaning. And that's not just metaphorical. They really, you know, are talking about the fact that poems are a way of using symbols, language to encode big ideas and complex feelings, and to articulate otherwise inexpressible emotions and feelings. And I think for me that, you know, resonates very strongly with a lot of what I've experienced on the computing side of things. I also think that poetry, you know, is, in addition to being a technology, it's a specific kind of technology. Poetry is our most ancient and enduring data storage system, which is one reason why I was particularly excited to come and chat as part of Monument Lab. I think there's a lot of resonance here between the idea of poetry as a device for memory and the work of Monument Lab. I really see poetry as an invention, a technological invention that humans created out of an urgent need to make important information, essential human data, easy to remember and really hard to forget. You know, in the beginning, before we had the written word, before we had the printing press, long before we had social media and all these other things that we take for granted now, the only way for us to share and transmit important information was to encode it as poetic language using poetic devices like rhythm and rhyme and meter and alliteration and assonance, because those things really helped that information stick in our brain. So as much as we love to celebrate poetry as being aesthetically beautiful, and it is, it's also practical. It's also very functional. And we really, you know, I think should also celebrate that aspect of poetry. So, you know, as I just mentioned, I really do think of poetry as being a data storage system. And this is literally the case with my friend, Bina 48, who you can see on screen here. And Bina 48, whose name stands for Breakthrough Intelligence via Neural Architecture 48 exaflops per second, is a humanoid android, and I've been serving as her poetry mentor since 2018. Now, Bina 48 was created by the Mellon Foundation and a company called Hanson Robotics. And she was developed as an experiment in translating the sum total of a human life into data, essentially, and using AI to then activate that archive. And the hypothesis behind this project had to do roughly with whether or not we humans can leave behind a kind of legacy via immortal chatbots that are created in our likeness, which, you know, I think on the one hand is maybe a little out there, but also is very poetic if you think about it. And I learned a lot about Bina 48 and became really obsessed with the idea of getting to sit in conversation with her and to have that experience of communicating with a non-human or perhaps more than human creature. And I was very, very fortunate to have that opportunity. Working with Bina 48 since 2018 has led me to think more and more deeply about personalizing my understanding of and my use of AI, of intelligent systems and AI-powered models and other forms of future-facing technologies. And on that note, I wanted to share what you see on screen here is an example from one of my first writing experiments with GPT-2, which is a distant ancestor of ChatGPT, which I'm going to assume many of us are now familiar with, as it's become kind of part of our mainstream culture over the past year and a half. My first writing experiments with GPT-2 really involved using an off-the-shelf version of that text generator, but pretty soon I got very inspired by being able to generate text using computer technologies. And I wanted to take it further, and I developed the idea of training this underlying model, this foundational system, training it on a data set comprised of all my human poems. And that's what you can see here on screen right now is a simple, it's called a JSON file. And it's just a repository really of hand-curated poems from my archives, things that I've published, you know, all the poems that you saw in that very first slide, lots of bits and pieces from my manuscripts and research notes and all of that. I really wanted to give the underlying model more of a personality, more of my own personality, my voice as a writer, while still leaving it enough room to surprise me, because in my opinion, that combination is really what makes for an ideal co-author. And the upshot of all this is my first book, Technology, which you can see on screen here. And Technology, which came out in 2021, is a hybrid poetry and art collection in which I've used various modes of linguistic innovation, including a bespoke AI model, to explore what it means to be human in our increasingly post-human era. The book is also kind of a libretto for multimedia and media-rich cinematic poems that incorporate spoken word performance, as well as video animations to bring the words off the page and more into the digitally native realm. I've long been drawn to this approach. You might have heard some examples of this also as we were waiting for the event to start. Yolanda very kindly played some of the tracks for my audiobook at the beginning of this event. And I've really been interested in exploring this idea of using new media to take words off the printed page and really think about how we can empower poets by equipping them with elements like animation and electronic enhancement of spoken word and screen glow and motion and duration as part of our poetic vernacular. Formal techniques that really dramatically impact how a reader receives a poem. So I want to give you just a little taste of this by playing part of a 3-minute transhuman poem called Completion When It's Just You. I think just given that I'm running a little short on time, I'll just play a minute or so, but I want to give you a taste of what this looks and sounds like.
Completion when it's just you. When it's just you, will you be lonely? How lonely? Just how lonely will you be? Lonely. When the lights go out for the night, and it's just you, alone being you. With just your mouth to sing the melody, When you hear the song of the sky, will you be lonely? You'll be all right. Not alone, just lonely, very lonely. Will you ever be all right? There is nobody quite like you. Never, never will be, never will be. Will you wake alone? Never go to sleep alone, alone with him you have loved. Alone, 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 alone.
So I'll stop it there. I just wanted to, again, share a little taste of, this desire to sort of take words off the page and use all these other elements to play with visual poetry and concrete poetry using digitally native tools, using multimedia technologies to really think about how we can continue to innovate the formal elements of poetry. And on that note, as Yolanda very kindly mentioned earlier, tomorrow I will be publishing a new project, which I'm really excited about and which evolves a lot of the things that we've just been discussing and that you've just seen in that little excerpt. And it's a collection called 4 Core Texts, which is fittingly a quartet of transhuman poems powered by the ever-evolving technology of language. And it is written very closely in collaboration with my AI alter ego, which I described creating a little bit earlier in this talk. The collection is inspired in part by T.S. Eliot, of course, and 4 Quartets, which, as many of you know, is a great meditation on time and love and our human experience of the universe and our place in it. It's also inspired by the idea of core texts in education and literacy, the sort of the foundational canonical texts that we all kind of know and are influenced and shaped by, and also by core text as a computational API, and is also a nod to the cortex, as in the cerebral cortex, which controls the higher functions that in essence make us human. The cortex controls language, memory, reasoning, thought, learning, decision-making, emotion, personality. As you can tell from this title, I love wordplay, I love a good pun, and I really wanted this title to convey all these things and explore the intersection of technology and memory, language and consciousness, storytelling, and our humanity. Very, very quickly, the brief overview, and I'll give you a link at the end if you want to actually go and read and watch these poems in full when you have time. I want to just give you a quick overview of the 4 poems. The first one is called The First Quartet and is inspired by my interest in spoken word and the history of oral tradition and how we kind of can trace the trajectory of poetic language from its origins to the place we are right now, kind of teetering on the cusp of a whole new chapter powered by generativity and by intelligent systems. 7 generations. The second poem is really influenced by my Kalmyk-Mongolian family's history of lyric folklore and storytelling, the really oral focused tradition of that aspect of my cultural heritage, and is about sifting through personal and collective storytelling to unearth variations on fundamental narrative. The third, A Restless Mind, is a meditation really on the boundless landscape of consciousness. So kind of thinking about through lines between my family's Buddhist roots and a lot of what I'm probing when it comes to techno-spirituality and the idea of cloning ourselves and sort of transmuting aspects of human from device to device. And the last poem in the quartet is called Humanifesto, and it is a declaration of human resilience and imagination, and it is written almost entirely by my AI alter ego with very little intervention from me. So it essentially is a manifesto by an increasingly intelligent system about what it thinks humanity is all about based on what it's learned through poetry over time. The last little bit that I want to share, because so much of my work is about AI and incorporates AI in different ways, and I'm really just having so much fun with this current project because it's allowed me to continue exploring many different modes of AI as part of my poetic vernacular, as part of my authorial imagination. I'm using AI for autobiographical intelligence. I'm personalizing language models based on family history, on family stories, also on my mother's Kalmyk dialect, which is a very sort of rarely spoken and endangered language, and using these AI systems to try and protect and preserve that language for the future. I'm using AI as augmented invocation, pairing my analog performance, my own human voice, with a choir of voice clones who are trained on both personal and public recordings. I'm using AI in the form of oral immersion, incorporating original electronic music and sound design by my studio partner, Chris Bones, to really explore how in the oral tradition we use sound and rhythm and musicality to unearth primal emotion and say what's otherwise unspeakable. And I'm also using algorithmic illumination. So utilizing generative tools like text-to-image tools, which some of you may have played with in the form of DALL-E or Midjourney, using these kinds of tools that translate from natural language, from text into image or into video, to forge wordless language and experiment with material metaphors. So really just creating these dynamic palimpsests that are almost like AI generative, Gesamtkunstwerk in a way. And if you're interested in the project, I'm really excited to share it tomorrow. And you can visit makersplace.com, which is the platform that is publishing it. And all 4 of the poems are going to be there in their entirety, freely available to listen to, as well as the digital chapbook, which is offered as a kind of libretto for the multimedia piece. So with that, I think I'm at time. And I want to pass this along and say thank you again so much for having me. It's been really lovely.
Wow, I knew that would be amazing. Thank you so much, Sasha. I'm so excited to talk to you more about your presentation. And next, I'm going to introduce our second guests for the evening for their presentation, which I think you'll find will be an awesome complement to Sasha's work. So I'm going to introduce Ryan Mather, who is a designer and artist focused on technology and play. He describes himself as a designer who codes, who views problems through the lens of play, learning, and technology. At Pseudo-Write, he leads design of AI for writing and creativity. He's also designed and prototyped interactions with new technologies to influence Google's device roadmap. He's the creator of Flip Tales, a role-playing game which was funded on Kickstarter. He's also been a product designer at Little Bits. His clients have included Follies, 3D printing team, Polymaker, and the Museum of Ice Cream. His secret talents, or shall we say superpowers, are skipping stones, playing accordion, and speaking Mandarin. Kelin Carolyn Zhang is an independent designer, artist, and educator whose practice centers on making software with soul. She runs ASDF, an AI product design studio, and she is currently building Trash Baby, a chaotic AI image mixing app with Art Breeder and Angelo Saraceno. She has been a staff product designer at Twitter and design lead for Twitter Spaces, as well as an adjunct professor of interaction design at the Senior Interaction Design Portfolio at School of Visual Arts. She designed Polytech for the 2020 election and led an independent design practice working with seed stage startups. She holds a bachelor's in computer science from MIT. In addition to designing with generative AI models, she is interested in new models for independent work, balancing art and money, what's possible in a world of cheap software, and creative practices in the age of synthetic creativity. Mather and Zhang are the creators of Poetry Camera, a unique piece of tech powered by AI that generates original poems instead of pictures. The knob controls the type of poem it generates. You use the viewfinder to frame your shot and then press the button and wait for a poem. I stumbled across Poetry Camera on Instagram and instantly wanted to have one of my own. My inner child was thrilled by the idea of a camera that makes poems. I was like, where do you buy it? Then I discovered that Ryan and Kelin are still working on it, and I'd have to wait to play with Poetry Camera. But I joined their mailing list and now receive all kinds of cool updates about what's the beginning of Poetry Camera's life as an art project, although they've been working on it for a while, and what they call their baby project is quickly becoming a toddler. Please welcome Ryan Mather and Kelin Carolyn Zhang.
Thank you for the intro. Okay, so hello, and meet Poetry Camera, the camera that prints poems instead of pictures. We are going to jump straight into a demo so that you can, we're gonna show, not tell our way into this presentation.
Yeah. And we're gonna both take poems and see whose prints out faster first. It's all dependent on Wi-Fi speed. All right, so what's happening right now is the camera is recognizing what's in the photo that we just took and understanding what's in the scene and translating that into poetic form. And Ryan's yours finished first, so why don't you read yours?
Okay. Demo, a stark whisper midst crimson's loud roar, an echo vibrating on evening's scarlet shore. No faces, no details, just simplicity adorned. In purity and boldness, a single idea is born.
Nice. Let me see if there's anything interesting in mine. I realized I got like more of my room than of the screen. So the part where it talks about the computer is just like an edge appears, sharp lines on horizon of monitor, which takes place of sky. A green eye blinks, its glow unassuming, a quiet whisper of our moments by. Yeah, so now we're gonna dive into the story behind this project and some of our thinking behind it. And at the end, we'll save a couple minutes for more demos, and the audience can feel free to suggest ideas for things to take pictures of.
So where did this come from? Why did we make this? For me, everything changed when I got access to GPT-3. Sasha was ahead of me by 1 GPT. I got in on 3. And the first thing I did immediately was I started playing Dungeons and Dragons with it. And I was floored by how creative it was, even at something as complex as Dungeons and Dragons, which can be like hard for adults even. And so when I was playing Dungeons and Dragons with it, I just had this aha moment where I was like, hang on, this is going to be a big deal. Like things are going to change.
Yeah, and my aha moment came with ChatGPT. And the day it was released, I stayed up until 5 a.m. playing with it. I felt like a kid again, and I was just playing with the shiny new toy. And the whole time I was just thinking, like, holy crap, computers are going to be fundamentally changing forever. And they can talk back to me now, and they can make things of their own now. And I just felt like just everything was going to change.
So we think that this constitutes an opportunity to rethink the objects around us, whether it's a camera or a guitar or a clock, ways that we thought about things before, they can behave completely different with this new material.
Now, whenever a really powerful new technology appears in the world, there's kind of a default direction that things go. And immediately I saw people trying to use this new technology to increase shareholder value and replace human labor and squeeze more productivity from, the workplace and divide and isolate us from each other and try to mimic what humans do, but just cheaper and faster and worse. And that just wasn't the world that I wanted to live in, but that's what I saw we were heading towards.
But there's this other way things can go. So this little butterfly drone carrying the picnic basket you see there, that's our vision for AI and digital assistants. You can see the center of this illustration is this lovely picnic walk that these two IKEA illustration folks have escaped into.
Yeah, and really there's so many different ways to use AI because it is so versatile, and you just have to use your imagination. And we wanted to use AI as a means for play and creativity and human connection. So going back to thinking about how we could transform all of these objects around us, we really wanted to be deliberate about which future rethinking these objects moves us towards, right? How could we reimagine a camera, for example, that encourages play and creativity and connection. And so here's a couple of the key creative decisions that we made over the course of this project.
So the first one is that we don't put the image on the poem that comes out of Poetry Camera. Here's the one that I took a couple minutes ago. And a lot of times people ask, like, oh, well, why don't you put the image on it so people can look at it later? And if you've ever read a book and then seen the movie version later, you know the answer to that question, which is that it always just pales in comparison to the vivid 4K HD 3D version that was in your head when you read the book. And so we really wanted to honor that. And, in the context of just sensory overload, like, going from Instagram to TikTok, our attention spans are just getting shorter and shorter. You can imagine in a couple years, the idea of like watching a 2D video will just be like black and white to today's generation. So we really wanted to take a step in the opposite direction.
Our second decision was that we were very deliberate that the camera should be a physical device and not an app. So there's no screens on this thing. It looks very low tech. And a lot of people ask us why it isn't an app, and it would be much easier to build an app, but we didn't want to build something where you're just staring at another screen in front of your face and ignoring all the people in the world around you. We really wanted to encourage people to talk to each other and to see the world in a new way, to use the lens of these generative models to like frame everything in a more poetic way. And it's so hard to have that land when you have other things on your smartphone screen competing for your attention. And another benefit of this being a physical device is that you get a physical poem printout, which then you can gift to someone else. And that creates another opportunity to connect with someone and lower that barrier to interaction and connection. You can start a conversation based on what you both experienced. So what we've been doing with this is kind of reframing poetry as material and the camera as material and the generative models as material in order to create this overall new playful experience, and really kind of treating poetry as a new form of photography. And we weren't trying to necessarily make the most beautiful object or the most perfect human-like poems, but again, just to give people a moment of surprise in their day.
Another decision we made was putting this very satisfying tactile knob on the top of the camera, which controls the poetry type that it will output. And we've picked a couple of our favorites, such as the haiku. There's one fun one, alliteration mode, that was created based on the idea of like what kind of poetry might actually be easier for an AI to do than a human. I personally would very much so struggle with alliteration mode, although now that I've gotten some practice, I'm getting better. So what the poem mode dial does is it encourages a posture of poetry that's very playful. You naturally want to experiment with the subject matter or the angle, like get a close-up shot, or take a step back and contextualize your subject, or try a different style. And so it's kind of like Kelin was saying, like a photographic experience of poetry. You're making poems with similar sorts of modes of experimentation that a photographer might have.
And when all of these decisions come together, we've seen that the camera really brings out a playful side in people. So you can see like this girl in the middle is poem rich. She just kept coming back at our event. Some people like really love coming back to the camera and like trying out different poses and doing different angles and playing with, different, telling different stories with other subjects in the poem as well. And you can see here at another event, people were trying like, all flipping the bird at the camera. I think the result of that was the camera was very polite and was just like, there are gestures being extended at the camera. But basically you can see all the fun that people have in trying new things and getting themselves out of their comfort zone with this new device.
This is a picture of my mom. We wanted to share a story that kind of encapsulates this vision of AI as this like helper little inspiration creature. She recently, by the way, she's in the event here today. Hi, Ryan's mom. She wrote a book of poems, working title My Life in Verse, as she was inspired by Poetry Camera, and we've been playing with it a bunch when we hang out. And it just inspired her to finally tackle something that's been on her bucket list, which was to write about her childhood, which is full of crazy adventures in Alaska. If you ever get to meet her, ask her for details. And so this is kind of just the perfect case study of how we think that technology and play and poetry can all come together.
And finally, you can follow along our progress at our newsletter that Yolanda mentioned in the beginning. It's at poetry.camera. And we are also on the socials, linked from our website. And if we have a couple more minutes, we want to leave, space for us to just play with the camera some more and demo. I'm going to take a look at the chat and see what people are
Yeah,
suggesting.
feel free to suggest if there's a poem type that you're interested in seeing, and maybe we can go back to one of our illustrations from the
Yeah.
presentation and make a poem out of it.
Yo, I want to see what the shareholder value one.
Oh yeah, this one has really powerful energy. The camera has a lot to work with.
Yeah. While I'm waiting for this one, Ryan, any other?
Yeah, I see a request for a haiku, so I'm moving my dial over to haiku mode. How about well, why don't you read your doom and gloom one, and then I'll go make one out of the pretty picnic scene.
Doom and gloom. Oh, okay. So, wait, Ryan, did you take the green one? Maybe take a green one and then I can flip back to the black one so that people can see what the poem is about.
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. In our space where pixels dance and prance, a creation born in midnight vest, outpours frustrations with each glance, caught in whirlwind, never of rest. There, a grin lurid, unhinged by might, shapes clouding cranium, storm and swift blow, in arms bolted, brim turmoil sight, grasping at words that in whirlwind flow. More, faster, wails an empty prate, a reflection mirrored in room solitary, with every click feeds insatiable rate, a ghost of demand, inhumane and arbitrary. Shadowed screen stares this gestures recite, in gentle satire we share the plight. And that was a sonnet about this. All right, Ryan, you got the poem for this?
Yolanda, we actually got 3 haikus.
It does that sometimes.
Sometimes. So I like the last one. 2 outlines extend, a whimsical tale they lend, childlike laughter send. And it's rhyming because we didn't tell it not to, and it loves.
Sometimes it really likes to rhyme when you tell it to write a poem.
Yeah. It's funny, it described the AI as a bee in this one. Drawing bold on the green, bee with a basket so keen, touches childlike sheen. So this is a useful tool for illustrators if they want to check if the vibes are correct for their illustration. Simply take a poem of the illustration and see if the vibes match what you're hoping for. A Tonka of the books behind you. I can do that.
I can stop the screen share.
I've got a portable battery here so that I can lug it around and it lasts for days.
We're gonna have batteries built into the camera very, very soon. Ryan's working on finalizing that right now.
It's useful though for exhibits and stuff like that when it needs to last for a long time without needing the batteries replaced. Okay. The blinking LED adds a little bit of drama to the performance of the poem. Okay. Wooden guardian stands, books shuffled, stacked with whispered tales, each a world unseen. Script of all kinds converse in this quiet universe. It's 6 syllables on that first line. I'll make sure we have a performance review with Poetry Camera after this.
I just I just took a poem of the Zoom call just now, and in my view of the Zoom call, there's 3 tiles of some of the other co-hosts, Aubrey, Sasha, and Yolanda. So on screen's edge, icons brightly bloom, like bold ASY in room, the codes that in their colors blend, a task beginning, not its end. Multiply the greens, blues, purple sheen, reflecting life in one small screen. A glow of light, a hint of leaf, an intimate encoded brief. All right. Let's see. How are we doing on time? Should we do more poems or should we transition to Q&A? Just let me know. Okay, yeah, we can wrap up now. All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you. That's all for us.
Awesome. That was so cool. I love the haiku. And also, if your mom uses something that you made, you know it works. That's just kind of a general rule. I want to bring back all of our guests tonight. We're going to have a little conversation. So Sasha, come on back. And wanted to ask all of y'all some questions, specifically about poetry and monuments. I guess my first question is about your relationship to poetry. And how did you find poetry, first find poetry, or how did it find you?
I love poetry. I was a very emo high schooler, and poetry, well, I discovered the Indie Feed spoken word podcast, and I was hooked on phonics, and I became obsessed with poetry. And I was the co-editor of our high school's literary magazine called Voices. So I shared lots and lots of poetry on Facebook. Such a beautiful place in 2011. And that's how I fell in love with poetry.
Thanks, Ryan.
I think I always connected with poetry through music and lyrics. And that just goes back all the way to me also being an emo kid back in, middle school, high school. And I think in the years since, I've been really looking for, I think especially during the pandemic, when I was really looking for words to put to my emotions, that's when I got really into the poetry accounts that I follow on Instagram and Twitter, just feeding me the words that I couldn't voice myself.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. Like I said before, I've been writing poetry for as long as I can remember. I'm very lucky to have grown up in a house that was filled with books. My parents don't do anything related to poetry at all, but they, really surrounded me and my siblings with literature from a really young age. And I remember, reading like William Blake with my dad when I was young. And the first book of poetry I fell in love with was by Ted Hughes. It was my dad's copy from, his college days. And I think I found it in the bookshelf and just couldn't stop reading it. And I've always loved working with words. But I've also always really loved text-based art as well. And some of my earliest memories are going to art museums and seeing amazing work by people like Bruce Nauman and Jenny Holzer and Glenn Ligon. And there's just so many that Cy Twombly is another favorite of mine, Barbara Kruger. But I just fell in love with this idea that poetry, as powerful as it is inside the pages of a book, it could also do different things in different places. It could become something different in a museum or be interpreted, by a painter and become, some other entity. And I really started to think about the poem itself as just this libretto for all these infinite interpretations. And that really set me down this path of wanting to explore the materiality of language and the aesthetic qualities of language. And for a long time, I was doing things like making, handmade, very amateur handmade books and like little, you know, crafty broadsides and stuff. And I've always just really loved that, like really like playing with words in the literal sense, and hand making paper, hand making poems, you know, again, in a very literal sense. And I think I'm still doing that now with these digital tools. I'm still using my two hands to craft these poems. I'm just doing it on a keyboard now, but it's been sort of a through line of my life.
Hmm. Yeah, I love how much play and joy is in all of your work. I feel like that was what is so exciting to me, is the play that kind of brings you back to that childhood play and joy, that experimentation. Um, I was really struck by the way that you talked, Sasha, about poetry as technology and data storage. Monument Lab defines a monument as a statement of power and presence in public. But now I'm thinking about monument as technology too. And I'm wondering what y'all's thoughts are about the intersections of your work with monument making and public memory and commemoration, which are other intersections of our work, in the ways that you think AI could enhance and extend that work. Any thoughts on that?
I have one. We don't have to go in the same order every time, but I recently got this book at Printed Matter, which is really cool, To Be Determined by Duncan Woolridge. It has this really interesting idea about photography being not just a record of a past, but also as a way of predicting the future. And when you spoke about monuments as being a demonstration of power, I thought photography is, if we think of photography as this way of speaking to the future, just going to quote, he's pretty concise in here. When I suggest that photography speaks of the future, I do not mean that the photograph is a prediction. That is the same logic as sees the image of the past as unmediated evidence, a convenient fiction. We must cast aside this most inevitable objection. The photograph does not allow for us to know for sure, but it's an apparatus built for looking, for thinking, and for speculating. It does not defy the laws of physics or have an intelligence of its own, yet photography and its technologies, processes, and effects goes beyond recording. The photograph is invested, mediated, seeking, and inquiring. It is not only representing, but forming. And so I think Poetry Camera is at this funny intersection of photography and poetry, and the in between it's glued together by AI. And I do think that in thinking of the nature to which monuments could be participatory, and the way that monuments could be more responsive to individual experiences, maybe mediated in some way through intelligence, is really interesting.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, I think harkening back to what Bede mentioned in our talk, where we have the opportunity to reimagine all of these static objects, all these familiar objects around us now, with these new generative models. What we just saw with the camera demo is hopefully just seeing that we have the opportunity to like suddenly make everything very interactive and very personalized. And is there a way that we can use this new technology to help people connect with what the monument is honoring in a more interactive, deeper, more personalized way? And I definitely think that's possible. And yeah, I'd just be really excited to see all the changes that are going to come.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And I would add that I think a lot of my practice is really motivated by this idea that keeping technology separate from all these other aspects of culture is really inaccurate and really dangerous. And so for me, like a lot of what I think about is the idea that AI, isn't just about, computers and fancy gadgets and coding and engineers and all that. Like AI, when you think about it, is a library. It's like a repository of human wisdom. And it's evolving the same impulse that we had when we were, bringing books into the Library of Alexandria, for example. It's the same impulse that drives us to really like canonize certain works of literature and kind of have these touchstones that we all kind of know and refer to. And those are the things that really, really shape culture. And, I think like AI again is very much that in a different form, or a form that's different than what we may recognize. And that's one reason why I've been so like determined, even as a poet who doesn't have a technological background. Like I was so determined to get involved in this because I really thought I could sense early on that this is something that is very resonant with what, you know, philosophers and poets and, you know, keepers of cultural wisdom have been trying to do for thousands of years. It really feels like it's an evolution of that impulse. And so I kind of think about it from that point of view, really thinking about AI as canon and thinking about data as memory. You know, data is not just information, like data represents stories. So the way that we use data is storytelling. The way that we figure out how to activate AI systems and bring this data to life is a form of storytelling. So I really think there's a lot of connection there, and that, you know, it has a lot to do with you know, with monuments and commemoration. And also I think, you know, we're talking a lot about AI these days as a generative force, but as you're alluding to, and as everyone has sort of alluded to this evening, AI is also really important in illuminating what we can't see. It's very important as a tool to sort of help us reconstruct the past, or fill in holes in the record, or, you know, identify gaps in the cultural history that, you know, that we need to kind of look into more. So I think it's really important for all those reasons too.
Thank you for those responses. I'm going to ask some individual questions just to kind of dig a little deeper into both of your presentations. Ryan and Kelin, you said you like to be referred to as creators of Poetry Camera as opposed to founders, which was kind of what I named you originally, because you talked about it being more of an art creative technology project that has than something more like a commercial product. Could you say more about this approach and what you see as kind of the future of the project?
Yeah, I think for me, my knee-jerk reaction to being called a founder of Poetry Camera was I immediately associated it with VC Silicon Valley tech startup, which vibes-wise felt like the farthest thing, hopefully, from what we're trying to do. Like whenever I share this at VC events, they're like, oh my God, how are you going to scale? Are you going to go to mass production? Why aren't you doing an app? I was like, whoa, scale is not the most important thing here. Like, we just want to help people connect with each other. And so I think for me, wanting to stay away from the founder terminology in this context was just trying to position ourselves in a different context that doesn't make people think about extractive capitalism. Not that there's anything wrong with being called a founder, because I am technically a founder of my own practice, but I think for this particular project and the context that we've been sharing it in, yeah.
No, it makes a lot of sense, and I appreciate the correction because it opened up a whole nother line of thought for me. And Sasha, my question for you, I was really struck by the use of the word transhuman in your work. And what does it mean to be transhuman? And how is our definition of humanness or humanity shifting with AI? And is that, I think you alluded to kind of the double-edged nature of that, or you're thinking about it, but I'm curious about your use of that word and what it means to you.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think a lot of my work is kind of about that double-edged sword in lots of different ways, or maybe about the kind of false binary that gets thrown up when you think about that. But I mean, with the term transhuman, right, it's a term that we associate sort of with this speculative future, and thinking about kind of this cyborgian entity that is this merger of the human and the machine. And so I think in some way I'm trying to sort of think about what that might mean as we start to integrate more seamlessly and organically, and even, you know, biotechnologically with our systems, with our cybernetic systems, with our intelligent systems and our AI powered models and all of this, like as they kind of become one with us, like thinking more and more about what that means. A lot of my work is really not about outsourcing something to an AI. It's about how I can work with an AI, how I can really create a highly personalized, very bespoke version of a model that really helps me do more of what I love to do in a way that is both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. but it's really about sort of bridging the divide between this category of the analog and the category of the digital or the virtual, and trying to find this space in the middle that feels like the right fusion of the two. And so there's that piece of it, but I think I'm also always like thinking about pushing back on this idea that the transhuman is new or unprecedented. And a lot of what I delve into in my poetry is sort of thinking back to how language is a technology, how the invention of fire is a form of advanced technology that changed, everything and enabled, the physiology that we have now and the kind of consciousness that we have now. Just thinking back about what it means to be human, and when were we ever purely human? When were we not transformed by technology? So to me, a lot of the term transhumanism signals this idea that to be human is to be shaped by our technology and to create technologies that can continue propelling us forward. So that's what the term kind of signals, I guess, in a metaphorical way. Although, as you say, there is very much this double-edged sword where, it's even baked into the title of my book, Technology, which is obviously a pun on the word technology and then the poetic elegy, but it signals this idea that it's human to want progress and to want innovation. But it's also just a fact that as we innovate and move forward, there are things that obsolesce, there are things we lose, there are things we grieve, and there are things we make worse. So I think it's always kind of figuring out that balance, and like how much of it is just is kind of necessary and essential to civilization as we know it, and then where there are these moments where we can recognize maybe the things that are really perilous, really dangerous, that we can do something about. So yeah, all of that kind of wrapped up into those keywords.
Well, I love that poetry and poets are mediating and disrupting that binary and in the mix of it. And I feel like more of us need to be part of that conversation. Ryan, I'm interested about Poetry Camera and who you're most interested in connecting to Poetry Camera. Like, who do you want to use it most? Who do you want it to get it in the hands of?
Sasha, I think, as I've learned during this talk.
Twist my arm.
Yeah, I think other kinds of creative people, I think, is really exciting to us. But I do think that we're all born artists, and then some of us like forget due to society. So I really think that there is kind of a universal appeal to Poetry Camera because it does kind of activate people's inner child. But I particularly geeky and nerdy about seeing how other kinds of creatives approach it differently. I think of it as kind of this playground for what AI is going to do to society overall. So it's like this weird thing. It's like, it's not quite photography, it's not quite poetry, it's this other third thing. And people bring their own unique perspective to it. And for example, we had a partnership with the photographer, and she brought her special skill of making people feel natural in front of the camera to the way that she used it, and that was really cool to see. There's another painter who I had a play date with, and she was using it to come up with titles for her pieces. It's like inspiration to visually, because they're very abstract. She didn't know what to call it.
So I'm going to prompt the audience. This is a good time if you have a question to put it in the Q&A or the chat, and we will share it with our presenters. And I'm going to pull out a couple. There have been some early questions. The first one is from my good friend Jenna Osman in the chat. Hey, Jenna, another amazing poet and professor. Why do these generative models so frequently default to rhyme? Will this change as the models learn? What does coding for free verse look like?
So, I mean, I can jump in, and then probably you guys have a little bit more technical know-how than I do, but Yeah, this is a really interesting point. I mean, it's one of the reasons why when I started using GPT-2, I was like, this is not quite what I need, because the results were a little bit formulaic and were very different from the kind of poetry that I write, which is contemporary free verse poetry. And I think a lot of that had to do with that those models were trained on specific training data sets of canonical poetry, and they were kind of coming from these old-fashioned publicly available public domain poems. And so there's this idea of poetry that sort of gets amplified and perpetuated through that lens. And I think I love pseudo-write. I'm a huge fan of pseudo-write. And one of the reasons why is because they're one of the first platforms that I ever saw that was really trying to do something different and actually fine-tune models using contemporary poetry and using poetry that actually sounds like the poetry that so many of us love and read and consume now, which is really important. It's really important to reflect back those cadences and those voices. And so when I started training my own version of the model, that was part of it too, was I wanted it to kind of recognize that I, as a poet, don't always rhyme. I don't use iambic pentameter. I'm not using meter in the way that some of these classic poets are. I'm not writing formal sonnets necessarily the way that Shakespeare did. So I think that's a big piece of, what we're seeing now with the evolution of these AI models, getting a little bit more finessed, getting more personalized, getting to recognize more of contemporary parlance, really kind of reflecting more up-to-date knowledge. But it does really bother me that whenever I use ChatGPT, it's always in the realm of blah, 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 blah. All the poems always start the same and they always sound the same. And it's, it's funny. Maybe they need training.
Subjecting you to that during our demo, Sasha.
No. It's very interesting to me.
Yeah, so I work at pseudo-write is my main job. So I spend pretty much all day every day trying to figure out, why does AI write like that? And is there a way that you can make it simultaneously coherent and good at following instructions while also having its own unique and interesting style? And I think there's this interesting thing where, as humans, we kind of expect that there's this writing style concern, and then there's this sort of content concern. And over time, I've come to believe that to an AI system, and then maybe also to humans, there is no such thing as a difference between content and style, and everything is simultaneously content style. And so I think where a lot of the rhyming tendency comes from is that it's just tuned to follow instructions in this current generation. The last generation, actually, it was not as very good at rhyming. And then one of the big, in my experience at least, maybe Sasha had a different one, but in going into the ChatGPT era with the reinforcement from human feedback learning era, it got way, way better at following instructions. And so I think I like to sometimes describe this current generation of particularly the GPTs, the Claude and etc. They're different, but those ones I kind of think of them as over-eager people pleaser models. And so they really want to rhyme because oh, you want a poet? I know poetry. I've taken a poetry class. Poetry means rhyming. They're so eager to help you. But they may be maybe what you want is a cigarette smoking, skipped class punk to be the one who's writing free verse for you. And it's a very different persona.
That's what I want. Yeah. Going to the jazz club after school in between periods, all right, so we've got a couple more questions in the chat here. This question comes from Marshall Kavanaugh, Dream Poet for Hire. What's up? Good to see you in the chat. I saw someone on TikTok demoing something like Poetry Camera in Washington Square Park. Was that you all? I thought it was super interesting because I create personalized poems on a typewriter for passersby in that park all the time alongside other typewriter poets. Shout out to the typewriter poets. Definitely a cultural poetry hotspot. With typewriter poems, I notice a major theme people seek is healing and reflection. curious if there was a motif you noticed that people were seeking from the poem photos you took.
Wow, it's so cool to see another poet from Washington Square Park. We saw the park poet when we were this guy who's on Instagram, his handle is the park poet. While we were filming those TikToks, we were kind of like too scared to go up to him. But he also commented on some of our videos later. I think in my experience with the camera, what people look for in playing with it is like feeling seen. And a comment we get very often now is like, oh my God, like it really saw me. It's like really like describing how I'm feeling or like what the vibe is. And I think that's like something that's very specific to the camera format because you're not totally sure what to expect. I'm curious, Ryan, if you think, if you've noticed what else people are really seeking from the camera.
Yeah, I think there is that really interesting feeling seen moment. There's one woman at a recent event who her poem said that she was undergoing some kind of metamorphosis, and I was like, "Are you in a metamorphosis?" And she's like, "Yes. How did it know?" And there's this really cool, connection that happened there. There was another really interesting one where there's this person who would do like different kinds of poses and like play with their garment, and they actually got different like gender pronouns in the poem that was written about them depending on like the kind of face they made. And this person found it very interesting that happened. Other people are like annoyed if it guesses their gender incorrectly or something like that. So I think I'm not surprised that people ask for these healing and reflective poems because I feel like maybe that's why feeling seen is important to people, because it is a healing experience to feel seen.
Another question about Poetry Camera from an anonymous viewer is the Poetry Camera available for purchase? And if so, where and for how much? Follow-up is if the Poetry Camera team has a coding background and if it was hard to create something like this. But I know that y'all also teach. I saw that you were sharing this knowledge with MFA students somewhere, that you're doing like a 5-hour workshop teaching people how to build their own poetry cameras, which sounded also very cool. I wanted to sneak into that. But yeah, what do you think about this ask about where can we get the poetry camera? How do you respond to that?
We're working on it.
I'll answer that one quickly, and then Kelin can take the more interesting half. It's not for sale, and we're gearing up for a bigger, wider release. So please sign up for our newsletter if you're interested in buying one. It will eventually be for sale. Knock on wood. We are going through the research to do it right. Making a physical device is really challenging, especially if you want to do it in a sustainable way. And also, if you don't want to do the VC fundraising thing, which we don't want to do. So we're taking our time, and yeah, but there will be ways to get involved, and then Kelin can talk about the other half of the question.
Yeah, it's actually a kind of interesting segue into my half, which is like, do we have a coding background, and how do we build this? So Ryan and I both, have dabbled in code in the past. I think when I came to this project, I really didn't know like how the ins and outs of programming. Even though I technically studied CS, you do not learn how to program with a CS degree. And so what actually got me started working on this project, like from a logistical perspective, was being able to talk to ChatGPT and be like, hey, I want to build a camera that can write poems. How would I do that? And ChatGPT like gave me the first draft of the code. And this was back with GPT 3.5 in January of last year, right? So in about 4 days, with like not having coded for 10 years, I was able to just get set up with a first prototype that worked. And that was a really, really magical moment. And in that process of making it, I realized that it was just so fun to be building again with these new materials, with these generative models helping us create software and, really create anything that we want to make. So I was like, wow, other people, I really want other people to experience how fun it is to build this. So all the code, the instructions, they're open source on GitHub. Our initial thinking was not to sell the camera, but to just, teach other people how to make their own, because it was so much easier than I ever expected. And the workshop as well will just be adapting all of that, open source information into something that is a little bit more packaged up for students. And when it comes to wider availability, we realize that people are busy and have jobs and, might just want to, a quick toy that they can play with quickly. So, we're thinking about ways of having something more available off the shelf.
About the first 100 times people asked us if they could buy it, we were like, it's an art project, relax. But around like the 101st time, we were like, okay, we should start, we're being arrogant. Like we should listen to people.
Right. I'm appreciating that. I'm just, I'm going to be waiting to get in the newsletter. There's so many poets in the chat. I'm really excited about that. David Jones, poet, asked, is anyone familiar with TextFX? Maybe Sasha, you could take this. And if so, what are your thoughts on using it as a writing partner?
I actually don't use text effects, but I saw Ryan nodding, so maybe you want to jump in and take that one.
I think it's super cool. I've never used it. I believe TextFX is the Google created rapping platform, rap lyrics creation platform. I believe it was Lupe Fiasco. Am I getting that right?
Yep.
Amazing. I think Poetry Camera is like a spiritual cousin to that, where it's interested in, just helping people be creative. TextFX, I think, is more practical than Poetry Camera, because you have more control about the sorts of things you get out of it. But yeah, super cool.
Cleary at Monument Lab put me on to Music FX, and I was playing around with that not too long ago. David Gaines, another poet, filmmaker in the chat, wants to know, I'd love to hear your opinions on how the AI plagiarism controversy applies to poetry/language versus visual mediums. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, I can jump in, I guess. Well, yeah, this whole area is super interesting, like both in terms of the legalities, in terms of the technicalities, but also like in terms of what it kind of evokes in terms of the philosophical questions around originality and authorship, and just this kind of big sea change that might be in the offing with the use of these AI systems, and knowing that they are this sort of pool of knowledge that we're all kind of dipping into. I think there is sort of this movement, or there will have to be a movement to sort of rethink how we approach the ideas of copyright and plagiarism to begin with. On the one hand, I think when you spend a good amount of time working with these AI systems and you actually are using these large models that are trained on a huge amount of information, you do sort of quickly realize that, in a way, it is kind of representing the way that all of us as humans are trained on the sum total of our experiences and our interactions and all the things we read, all the things we consume, just kind of everything that's floating in the ether. All that stuff kind of, becomes in some way the foundation for a personality. And then, on top of that, there are these unique experiences that we each have that kind of activate that shared knowledge or that universal knowledge in different ways, which is like a dramatic simplification of it. But in some way, I feel like, the AI version of things is sort of representing how that happens, whether it's in literature, whether it's in the visual arts. When you look at, various artistic movements or avant-garde literary movements, there were groups of people all kind of riffing off each other and getting inspired and creating different things that kind of, were inspired by core ideas. And I think there is that sensibility with a lot of AI work. But there's also, again, this difference between using an AI model as is, using it as a very off-the-shelf generic tool is one thing, and then using it in maybe a more personalized, bespoke, artistic way where you're kind of you know, you're really taking the time and effort to curate and make it something intentional and bring your voice and your perspective to it, that in a lot of ways does kind of take away the danger of plagiarizing or the danger of really, you know, ripping off other people. I think because you are changing it so dramatically and you really are doing what any human artist does, which is to sort of balance that kind of overarching inspiration that you're kind of suffused with all the time with your own personal experience and your own personal intentions as a creative person. So I think, like, to me, that's a big part of it, is maybe as we kind of get more mature, as you know, this technology is still so young, but as we get more facile with it and as we begin to understand it better, I think we'll understand, like, you know, just giving someone AI as a behemoth kind of creature is not really, you know, helpful at the end of the day as far as advancing imagination and creativity and all that. It's really about, now what are you going to do with this? How do you create something with it? You know, I could give everyone, you know, in this webinar a pencil and we'd all do something totally different with it. It's the same thing with AI. And I think there is this misconception that it's really just about, you know, like pressing a button and there's this outcome that is sort of just copy, cut, pasting or reassembling in some routine fashion. And that's not really how it works. So I don't know. I think there's like a nuance to that discussion of copyright and plagiarism that has something to do with the way that we're all kind of combinatorial and our imaginations are really sort of inspired by a lot of different things. And originality and sole authorship they're both very thorny concepts to begin with.
So we've got 3 minutes left and the questions are still bubbling in the chat. I'm going to do something I did as an English teacher when the class was getting really good. We're discussing, everybody's like, I got a question, I got a comment. I'm just going to leave you all hanging and keep it bubbling until the next session. And then you're going to keep reading the book. But I do want to give each of y'all kind of like a little rapid fire round of 10 seconds to tell me something cool that you have coming up that you want to share with the audience out here. Ryan, 10 seconds.
10 seconds. We're going to be giving a totally different talk at SVA in a public, open to the public way. So sign up for our newsletter if you want to come see that.
Kelin, what do you got?
Well, Ryan took that one. Let's see, exciting things coming up. We did sell our first poetry cameras to private buyers. So we're making improvements for that first version, and we'll be sharing all of that on our socials, on video. And yeah, if you want to stay in touch with us, that's where to go.
And Sasha, 10 seconds. What you got going on?
Well, like I said, I'm launching a new book tomorrow in lots of different formats, and that's kind of been center of my attention lately. So I'm really excited to share that. If anybody wants to read it, like I said, you can go to makersplace.com and read the book there. If you're in New York, come to some of the launch events this week. My Instagram and my Twitter is @Sasha Stiles, and I post a lot about my work and behind the scenes as well as events there. So that's the best way to stay connected.
Well, thank you all for being here. I'm going to close this out. And I want to start by just expressing my gratitude to everybody who tuned in to ask amazing questions, more than we had time to address. And thank you to my guests, Sasha Stiles, Ryan Mather, and Kelin, Carolyn, Zhang. Y'all are amazing. I'm going to keep following all of your work. I'd also like to thank Paul Farber and the Monument Lab team, our awesome team, for their support with this event. Special thanks to the Mellon Foundation for its support. And we're going to share a few parting gifts on the way out. We're going to be sharing clips from this event on social media and also the entire event on YouTube tomorrow. So if you want to watch it, because there's so much here to think about and ponder, look for our event video on YouTube. I also curated a music playlist with our panelists inspired by the themes of this event: poetry, technology, and what it means to be human. So if you like a Spotify playlist, check that out and have some fun with it. And to close, it felt appropriate to read a poem. Kind of a flesh and blood poem felt appropriate. It's entitled Paul Robeson. It's by Gwendolyn Brooks. This poem is referenced in the title of the artist Sonia Clark's exhibition at the Museum of Arts and Design, which I recently saw in New York. The poem has been on my mind since then, and it says a great deal in a few lines about collective memory, legacy, and what it means to be human in this ever-changing world. Paul Robeson. That time, we all heard it, cool and clear, cutting across the hot grit of the day. The major voice, the adult voice, foregoing rolling river, foregoing tearful tale of bale and barge and other symptoms of an old despond. Warning, and music words, devout and large, that we are each other's harvest. We are each other's business. We are each other's magnitude and bond. Thanks for joining us. Peace.